All right, we have one more before the voting begins. And next up is Dr. Todd Pierson from the College of Science and Mathematics. And you brought your fan club with you. That's great. And he will be presenting Uncovering the Secret Lives of Appalachian Salamanders. And do it to the beat, Todd, for extra points.
Leave it to the ecologist to be the undressed presenter. Okay, we can start. So somebody has probably told you once before that our Appalachian Mountains are not real mountains, but they're real. They're just as real as the Rockies or the Sierras. They're just much, much older. And for 450 million years, they've grown and shrunk and been reshaped by rivers and geologic processes. And they've got a great story to tell. And there's nothing better to tell that story. There's nobody better than a salamander. And so for the uninitiated here, a salamander is an amphibian. It's like a frog. But unlike a frog, they're not most abundant and diverse in the tropics, in rainforests. They're most diverse here. You live in the global center of salamander diversity. And I was really tempted just to spend 18 more slides showing you pretty pictures of salamanders, but I'm going to keep it to 4 pictures here to give you an idea just of the sense of the tremendous variation in size and shape and color and form and function you can find. These are all salamanders just from your own backyard here in North Georgia. And so my lab here at KSU studies the ecology and evolution and conservation of these salamanders. And tonight I'm just going to give you a quick preview of some of the research we do, the beautiful study organisms that we work on, and the places that we work, like this wintry Appalachian stream. It all starts with field work, and there's something really special about taking a student to the field for the first time on a rainy summer night, where you can see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of salamanders. People don't believe how many of these you can see. They're tremendously abundant. You see them running around the forest, chasing their prey and running from their predators and looking for each other to court on the forest floor. But not all of our field sites are remote, pristine mountain forests. We do a lot of research here in Atlanta. In some streams where you might imagine there ain't much nature left to be found. There's probably many microplastics. I didn't think about that before. These are really resilient organisms too. The salamanders can persist in some really challenging environments. And one of the things we study in the urban streams is how these urbanization, which increases the water temperature, makes the streams flood more often, increases nutrient input, changes the life cycle of a salamander. So they lay their eggs in the water. We study how that affects the timing of their egg laying, the growth rates of the salamanders, and then how they metamorphose into a terrestrial adult salamander. And one of the mysteries that's really stuck with us for these years is what you see pictured here. In some populations of our main study organism, this 2-line salamander, males that could be brothers or cousins found under the same rock look tremendously different. You probably notice a couple differences in the way their heads look here. And so we kind of suspected this was related to differences in behavior, but to answer that question, we had to come back to the lab because as many salamanders as you can find at night, it might not be enough to answer these questions. So we've got this great cold, dark salamander room on campus, which are the conditions that they like, where we can carefully observe and record salamander behavior and try to figure out what's going on with these two that look really different. So here's some of the things we've learned. This kind of male, which you call the searching male, has this fleshy looking mustache, which is actually a chemosensory organ that helps it crawl around in the forest and find its mates, helps locate them. So he's well adapted to a terrestrial life of courtship. The other males, instead, they lack that mustache. They have these giant jaw muscles, and they use those jaws to fight and bite their rival males. So these males are well adapted to life in an aquatic stream where they guard their female mates and the eggs that they lay. But we're not the first people to fall in love with these salamanders and want to study them. And so one of the other things we do is work with natural history museums like the Georgia Museum of Natural History, which house thousands and thousands of specimens from decades and centuries of salamander-obsessed biologists before us. And there's just a wealth of information in these specimens that we can gather. So my students and I spend a lot of time measuring and counting, examining, photographing these salamander specimens. We can learn about where they live today and where they lived 100 years ago, what species they live with, and what kind of interactions they have with those species. And there's some new technology we can bring to these old collections to learn a little bit more. So this just blows my mind. These are like 1 centimeter salamander skulls that we've put in a CT scanner, much like you could at the doctor. And we can see that even though in addition to these external differences, we notice these two kinds of salamanders, they also have really amazing, intricate differences in their skull shape and function. But some of these mysteries we can't answer in the field, we can't answer with a captive colony, and so we turn to a different toolkit, a molecular toolkit, like my student is pictured using here. So we collect a lot of salamander DNA. Salamander DNA is interesting. I bet you didn't know that their genomes are huge. They have some of the biggest genomes of any animal. Their genomes can be 25 times bigger than ours, which is a challenge. But we use some modern genomic and bioinformatic techniques on Kennesaw's high-performance computing cluster to reconstruct the evolutionary history of these salamanders. And they've got some really interesting bits of their histories, much like how many of you and me have parts of our genomes derived from Neanderthals because we hybridized long ago. These salamanders have these mosaic genomes from hybridization in the past. One other thing we do with salamander DNA is we act like nature's crime scene technicians. A lot of these salamanders are really hard to find in the wild. You can spend all day looking and come up empty-handed. But we can collect water samples from the stream, sequence the DNA that's there, and figure out what salamanders live in those communities. And this is most valuable when we work with our state and federal agency partners on rare and endangered species of salamander. So this one is a tiny salamander that lives in a very tiny part of Northeast Georgia and nowhere else in the world. And they're really hard to find, as you might imagine, for something that size, but this environmental DNA is great at detecting them. So I hope I've convinced you all to love salamanders. At the very least, I hope I've convinced you that it's a great hook to get students interested in the natural world and see the relevance of the science they learn in the classroom. Thanks.
Thank you, Todd.